What we're going to be focusing on today is assessing 3D models and then supporting 3D models. What I mean by assessing is taking a look at the model and determining how you want to orient it so that your support placement is both efficient and out of the way. We want to preserve as many details as possible on a 3D model, and we want to hide any blemishes that the supports create on unseen surfaces. So what I typically do to begin this process is import my model. Today's model is a Goblin Scout that has been provided by Claymore Miniatures. I do some support work for them, and we will be supporting one of their models today. Links to their store and their Patreon will be in the description of this video. First off, we bring in both the model itself and the base. I've got slightly different tacks I take for both of these, but the overarching goal is the same. We want to get as much detail out as possible while minimizing surface blemishes. So let's start right now with just the Goblin. We'll set the base off to the side. This particular Goblin, I like to get both the base and the model out. You kind of get an idea of how the model sits on the base. So for this particular model, we can see that it's going to be crouched up on this branch here. So a lot of the front face is going to be open and visible. The front of this crossbow is going to be a kind of a feature piece as well. So we know that we'll have connections to the base on the feet, and some of these underside portions are not going to be visible. We also know that this back side of the crossbow is facing away from where or how you'll generally be displaying this mini, so that is another good area for supports. We want to keep all aspects of the 3D printing in mind as we're doing our supports. It helps to think about how somebody would display this model on a shelf once it's printed. It also helps to think about all the steps it takes to get there as well. We're kind of in the beginning with the supports. We've got to think about how a model prints, and then also how easy it is to take the supports off a model. I go through an extra step after supporting everything to adjust my supports to make sure the supports print correctly and are easy to remove as well. It's a little bit above and beyond for somebody just printing stuff for home use. Since I know other customers are going to be using and printing these models, I like to make that experience as easy for them as well. We also want to remember that a successful print is the ultimate goal here. And we will minimize supports when necessary, but a successful print is going to waste far less resin in supports than a failed print will. So we go kind of pretty aggressive with supports just to make sure we get a good model in the end, because if we have half a print or a failed print, we're going to waste far more resin than we would with a few extra supports here or there. So that's kind of the tack we're going to take. But for now, we know that this guy is going to set up on this branch, and we'll kind of adjust him accordingly. For now, I'm going to put the base off to the side, and we will focus on this Goblin here. So this is how it will sit on its base. How a model sits on its base is not necessarily how you want to print it. We want to preserve features as much as possible, primarily features on this front-facing side, and then we want to create ideal support placements for ourselves as we go through this process. So looking at this Goblin, we can see we're in a pretty good place as it sits. We've got a lot of access to the underside of the model, and we have a lot of options for placing heavier supports and our more strong connections to the build plate. As we are thinking about the printing process, this kind of gridded base here is going to be our build plate, and it's a little backwards to think about, but this build plate is then going to be hanging upside down, and this model is going to print from the build plate up. So we need to support specific features. This particular model is going to be interesting because we're going to have a bunch of these little leaves to support on the back as well. So we've got a couple different texts to take here. I'm going to use my rotate tool and just kind of point this guy a little more up. Typically facial features and chins and ears and noses and sometimes teeth are very primary features that we want to capture on the front of a face. And generally we want to try to point these features facing up so we don't need to support them at all. This particular model, that also creates a little bit more access on the back here for us to support each one of these leaves. So looking at this guy, another tool I use that's part of the Pro version of Lychee is something called Layer Thickness Preview. So according to my settings for my machines, this is going to generate a preview of each individual layer that the printer is going to create. What we're looking for are all of these very beginning layers. We call these islands. These islands are where that particular portion of the model are going to start printing, and those are where we need to start supporting first off. So I like to turn this view on while I am orienting the model because it really gives me a hint as to where this model is going to start printing on all the individual features. The feet, the individual toes here each have a starting spot, the fingernails, the fingers. It really gives us a really good idea of where we're going to need to eventually begin to place supports. It also helps me determine how I'm going to orient this model. We can see here I mentioned that facial features tend to be hard and an area we really want to make sure we don't have any blemishes on. So I'm looking at this view here and I see we've got a little bit of island on the chin here. We can continue to move this model back and we see that that island begins to disappear. That means that I'm not going to need to support this portion of the face at all. Unfortunately, that means some of these pieces on his hat here are now free floating and we're going to need to support them, and they might be a little bit harder to get to. But if we think again back to how this model is going to be displayed, the bottom portions of these of his little hat here are going to be facing down, so we're kind of okay with any blemishes that might result. Again, this gives us a lot of access to the back to each one of these leaves. We see tip of each one of these leaves is a island and something we're going to need to support. So we're looking pretty good with that there. Unfortunately, tilting it this far back results in a lot of supports being placed on the back and another portion of the model that's going to be quite visible. Granted, we're usually looking at these minis from the front, but if we think about them on a tabletop or in the middle of a map while we're playing, the back is still fairly visible as well. So I'm going to, at the sacrifice of needing to support this chin a little bit, I might bring this forward a little bit more to keep some of the heavier and more sturdy supports that we're going to place to the underside of the model and a side that we're not going to see a whole lot of. As far as left to right, I don't need any of that right now. Everything's looking pretty centered. We're going to have good access to the back to support this whole crossbow. I think this is going to be a good place to start.